The second half of the 20th century witnessed a dramatic change in traditional gender roles, which was primarily characterized by the increased involvement of women in the workplace. Increased female employment has constantly been associated with reduced gender specialization and changes around gender role attitudes. Siegel-Rushton maintains that divorce rates went up after the Second World War, a period that was characterized by increased female involvement in the labor force. Noteworthy, 46% of women aged 15 to 44 were in paid employment in 1955, with this number going up to 60% in the mid-80s. Overall, Hegewisch and Lockhart observed that the percentage of all employed women has gone up from 44% in 1980 to 62.2% per the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Neoclassical models of union formation suggest that individuals form unions in anticipation that the utilities of the union exceed those associated with being single. The possibility of the utilities of divorce exceeding those of staying in a union results in marital dissolution. Pessin observes that the changes in gender roles at home and at work was accompanied by a withdrawal from marriage, reduced fertility, and increased marital instability. The element of marital stability presents the need to define marriage and divorce cultures. On the one hand, marriage culture is characterized by beliefs, assumptions, and practices that point towards the eternal nature of marriage. On the other hand, a divorce culture includes norms that present marriage as optional, and most importantly conditional. Ioannis observes that higher national divorce rates are linked to reduced fertility, delayed marriage, reduced cases of domestic violence, and increased participation of women in the labor force because women in societies with high divorce rates are more likely to be self-sufficient. Olah and Gall argue that women undertake less unpaid and more paid labor today than before, while men typically work the same number of paid hours and increased unpaid hours than before. Increased gender diversity has been accompanied by significant changes in gender attitudes. The fact that men's breadwinning norms still persist while women's homemaking roles are gradually fading implies that gender equality in the context of the home solely focuses on women's perception of fairness in the distribution of housework, while completely ignoring the division of breadwinning responsibilities, and men's perception of the same. Housework includes all activities surrounding cooking, cleaning, and child care, inside the home, but not outside. Pessin asserts that the prevalence of egalitarian social norms predicts a decline in union formation, with this decline only holding true for women who lack a college education. In other words, shifts towards equality predict a decline in marriage for women who lack a college degree. The prevalence of gender equality among college-educated women positively relates to union formation. The initial decline in union formation and increase in divorce is reported when traditional views are dominant in a particular society. Increased acceptance of egalitarian norms minimizes the risk of divorce and does not affect union formation. Pessin suggests that highly educated egalitarian-oriented women find marriage attractive and experience lower levels of instability, while lowly educated women practice marriage selectivity by choosing self-reliance over union formation and generally result in a decline in marriage rate. Pessin's findings partially support the gender revolution framework while highlighting the union formation barriers for lowly educated women as societies become more egalitarian. Stanley and colleagues support Pessin's findings in reporting that participation in premarital education is linked to higher levels of satisfaction and commitment in marriage. Premarital education, which refers to college education because high school is not as beneficial, is also associated with reduced conflict, thereby minimizing the risk of divorce. Particularly, the authors maintain that premarital education results in a 31% reduction in the risk of divorce. Reduced conflict is linked to better communication and conflict management by extension. Stanley and colleagues argue that premarital education has increased exponentially over the recent past from 7% of couples in the 30s to 44% for those who formed unions in the 90s. The racial order of participation in premarital education from the least to the highest likelihood is blacks, whites, and Hispanics, who are most likely to be educated because of the race's association with the Catholic Church. Dush and Taylor used the institutional and companionate models of marriage to examine the trajectories of marital conflict using data from the marital instability over the life course study. In a nutshell, the institutional model of marriage suggests that those who believe in the institutional of marriage, and subsequently have barriers to exiting marriage, report greater marital equality owing to the possession of positive attitudes towards marriage and minimally monitor if marriage serves their own interests. Dush and Taylor observe that women with traditional gender attitudes report happier marriages compared to those with egalitarian views. The companionate theory of marriage suggests that egalitarian unions report higher marital quality because partners share housework and decision-making equally. The model associates husbands' lack of participation in housework with increased conflict, tension, and unhappiness. The companionate model is supported by the equity theory, which suggests that fairness is important for marital satisfaction because female participation in the workforce is linked to increased familial well-being and increased work-family conflict. Dush and Taylor's study uncovered, and I quote, "Respondents who believed in lifelong marriage and shared decisions equally with their spouse were more likely to report low and less likely to report high conflict. A stronger belief in lifelong marriage, shared decision-making, and husbands sharing a greater proportion of housework were associated with an increased likelihood of membership in a high happiness, low conflict marriage, and a decreased likelihood of a low marital happiness group." Consistent with the suppositions of the institutional model of marriage, strong belief in lifelong marriage predicted membership in the low marital conflict trajectories and was associated with lower odds of membership in the high marital conflict trajectory. In support of the companionate model, equal decision-making was associated with greater odds of membership in the low marital conflict trajectory and lower odds of membership in the high marital conflict trajectory. Hence, a belief in lifelong marriage and marital cooperation in decision-making were associated with marital conflict. The more cooperation and belief in the institution of marriage, the less conflict. The authors reported that less than a quarter of the involved sample reported high marital conflict, 60% reported medium marital conflict and 17% reported low conflict. Siegel-Rushton suggests that men's home production results in marital stability, independent of their spouse's employment status, and offsets the destabilizing effect of female employment. The author argues that the overfocus on the positive relationship between female employment and divorce results in paying little attention to men's behavior. Particularly, the author argues that men's participation in unpaid work raises women's satisfaction and stabilizes dual-earning marriages. Increased uncertainties in the workforce, the rise in divorce risks, and the transitions between male and female behavior have minimized the benefits of trading and specialization and reduced men's ability to negotiate for traditional unions. The frequency of divorce increases the risk of specialization because women tend to focus on developing marriage-specific capital. Siegel-Rushton asserts that women's participation in the labor market has changed men's expectations outside marriage, thereby weakening their bargaining power that focuses on upholding traditionalist unions. Siegel-Rushton documents some reasons that account for the association between female employment and reduced marital stability. For instance, female employment eliminates the efficiency gains observed when women devote their time to the home, thereby making marriages more likely to dissolve. Male involvement in the labor markets is linked to increased marital stability, while women's involvement is associated with divorce, but equalizing paid and unpaid labor also equalizes leisure, which improves bonding time and the stability of unions. Siegel-Rushton maintains that the findings in the study are not conclusive because of some of the limitations, including the use of old data, selection bias that included parents who stayed together 5 years after childbirth, failure to account for men's and women's opportunity costs, and failure to capture the intensity and quality of men's contributions towards unpaid work. Therefore, it is important to examine additional information, especially on men's and women's opportunity costs, as well as their involvement in paid and unpaid labor. This report by the Institute for Women's Policy and Research presents some interesting statistics on the gender differences in the number of working hours. For instance, women's working hours have significantly gone up between 1977 and 2016, while men's have remained the same. Particularly, women spent an average of 9 more hours in paid labor in 2017 than they did in 1977. According to this graph, the number of working hours for mothers have dramatically gone up, while those of fathers have remained constant. A point to note is that fathers work more hours than other men, while mothers work less hours than other women. This study by Pew Research points out that women with children work an average of 3 hours less than those without children, while fathers work 7 hours more than men without children. Overall, when combining both paid and unpaid labor, fathers work 2 hours more than mothers. This other graph by the Institute of Women Policy Research suggests that married fathers work more hours than single fathers, while single mothers work more than married mothers. Purely based on this graph, it is evident that mothers with a breadwinning partner specialize in homemaking responsibilities, while single mothers focus on diversification. The graphs highlighted before suggest that Siegel-Rushton's suggestion of equalizing paid and unpaid labor is not as practical since partners in a union tend to focus more on specialization as opposed to diversification. Olah and Galler point out that studies on male involvement in unpaid labor and marital stability are not conclusive, with some finding a relationship, while others do not. For instance, in Germany, a country characterized by policies that promote gender specialization, breadwinner homemaker couples are least likely to divorce, with male involvement in domestic work being likely to increase the risk of divorce. In the United States, a country with liberal policies, female involvement in the workplace raises the risk of divorce, while the risk is reduced with male involvement in housework. This comparison between Germany and United States was undertaken by Cook, who uncovered that in Germany, disruption of female homemaking or male breadwinning roles through the push of egalitarian ideals increases the risk of divorce. In the United States, gender equality is associated with increased marital stability. The findings of the study suggest that the reinforcement of gender division of labor through policies could be detrimental to marital stability. Ola and Galler also point out that women in dual-earner households are more likely to report unfair distribution of work, which is linked to reduced marital satisfaction and increased risk of divorce, all of which hold true even when holding paid and unpaid hours constant. The authors also argue that husbands' housework increases marital quality for women, but not for men. Oshio and colleagues compared the association between the division of labor and marital satisfaction in China, Japan, and Korea. The study uncovered that the burden of wives' housework negatively correlated with marital satisfaction, a phenomenon similar to other Western countries. Chinese couples favored egalitarian division of housework, Japanese couples supported traditional specialization in the home, and Korean couples were more transitional. However, Korean wives work longer hours than their Chinese counterparts when employed outside the home. Increase in wives' income translated to more happiness for the Chinese, reduced happiness for the Japanese who favor traditionalism, and do not affect happiness for transitional Koreans. The fact that Asian cultures are more accepting of traditional specialization setups, despite some egalitarian advancements such as shared parental leaves, implies that housework-related conflicts significantly undermine marital stability. Oshio and colleagues argue that wives' housework burdens also reduce fertility by drawing a positive relationship between men's involvement in housework and fertility. Kubrick and colleagues maintain that economic differences in urban and rural China are associated with differences in the distribution of housework. Thus, the distribution of housework is largely dependent on economic circumstances as opposed to gender attitudes, with husbands participating more in housework when wives are working full-time. Gender-oriented ideological differences exist between rural and urban China, but these differences do not affect the involvement in housework. Overall, the study found a positive relationship between equality and marital satisfaction. Lair Essex and Hong assessed how the division of housework related to marital satisfaction. A positive relationship between spousal participation in housework and marital satisfaction was noted for mothers, but housework division did not affect fathers' marital quality. Division of housework also buffered maternal caregiving stress and minimized the strength of the relationship between children's bad behavior and caregiving burdens. The authors reported that there was more equality in grocery shopping and doing the dishes, with husbands spending more time shopping for groceries and wives spending less time doing the dishes. Noorani and colleagues examined the association between marital satisfaction, division of household labor, and gender role beliefs of couples in Iran. Gender role attitudes or beliefs do not correlate with marital satisfaction. Wives' participation in housework did not affect their satisfaction, but wives' marital satisfaction increased with husband participation in housework. Husbands' participation in housework also increased their overall marital satisfaction. Stevens and colleagues evaluated the effect of domestic labor, gender ideology, work status, and economic dependency on marital satisfaction. The authors report that status enhancement tasks and satisfaction in the division of house and emotion work predicted marriage satisfaction for women. Economic dependency, paid work hours, gender ideology, partners' hours spent on housework, contributions to emotion work, and number of children and preschool-aged children had only indirect effects on women's satisfaction, while hours spent on housework, contributions to emotion work, partners' emotion work, hours spent in the paid labor force, and number of preschool children had indirect effects on men's satisfaction. Partners do not exactly need a 50-50 sharing, but the sharing should be perceived as equal by both partners. Stevens and colleagues explain that studies on the relationship between the division of housework and marital satisfaction present a wide range of findings, including, wives' dissatisfaction with the distribution of labor increases marital conflict while husbands' does not, satisfaction with domestic work minimally influences marital satisfaction for both genders. Arguments in dual-learning couples arise when either partner feels like housework is unfair. Women with egalitarian ideologies are more likely to report unequal distribution of labor. Breadwinning men view their providing roles as contributing to housework, Non-providing men or men who earn less than their women avoid housework to protect their masculinity. Equal earners are more likely to share housework equally. Wives breadwinning minimally influence men's involvement in housework. Women's contribution to family income raises the likelihood of perceiving unequal division of housework as unfair. Partners who are economically dependent on their partners do not view unequal distribution of housework as unfair since housework is exchanged for economic support. This exchange entails doing gender. The relative resource theory suggests that men who are out-earned by their wives should do most of the housework, but this suggestion goes against doing gender. The gender ideological perception of equality entails the exchange of housework with economic support. A positive relationship between an egalitarian gender role ideology and a more egalitarian division of household labor holds more for men than women because egalitarian women do less housework. And the prevalent gender ideology influences the perception of inequality as unfair, with egalitarian women being more likely to perceive inequalities as unfair while initiating conflict around it. Hoop and Sear explain that women with children do twice as much housework as their husbands, with marital satisfaction for women being related to perceptions of equality, while men's satisfaction is linked to the division of housework. Suter observes that satisfaction with the division of housework moderately impacts men's and women's marital quality, even though it is a greater predictor of marital happiness and conflict compared to wives' employment and educational attainment. Age determines marital happiness through the related communication channel. Wives' marital satisfaction assumes a U-shaped curve across various life stages, with stages where there was increased contribution to housework being characterized by the lowest marital satisfaction. Husbands are more likely to report satisfaction with the division of housework, which is associated with men's likelihood to spend less hours on housework. Frisco and Williams observe that men and women who perceive housework distribution as unfair report lower marital happiness. Men in traditional setups are less likely to complete unfair share of housework, and those in dual-earner relationships are more likely to negotiate the terms of engagement in housework. Men who perceive their share of housework as unfair in dual-earner households are more likely to report reduced marital satisfaction. Frisco and Williams argue that the definition of housework equity is important since it differs for men and women. The feminine nature of housework implies that men in dual-earning unions perceive their contribution, which is half or less than half, as fair, with slight increase being perceived as unfair. Women who perceive housework division as unfair are more likely to divorce because of the increased work overload when combining careers with housework. Women in dual-earner relationships are more likely to perceive the distribution of housework as unfair because of higher egalitarian expectations. According to Frisco and Williams, despite our observation that housework equity is associated with marital happiness for both men and women, and despite the relationship between marital happiness and divorce, we found that most of the association between equity and divorce among women is not explained by marital happiness. When we added marital happiness to the model predicting odds of divorce for women, the relationship between marital happiness and the odds of divorce weakened only slightly and still remains significant. Equity appears to be a stronger predictor of marital quality for women, and amount of work completed appears to be a stronger predictor of marital quality for men. Levy and Katz examined the division of labor, perceived fairness, and marital quality in 3 ethnic religious Israeli groups that reflect traditional, transitional, and egalitarian beliefs. The authors found that for women, gender division of labor reduced the perceived fairness and lowered marital quality for transitional and egalitarian but not traditional women. Perceived fairness was not found to be that important for men as they do not view it through a similar lens as women. Particularly, women's perception of fairness is related to a fair share of domestic chores, while men lump all the family tasks together, including paid and unpaid, in judging the balance of fairness. In other words, women's perception of equality is related solely to the distribution of housework, while men's is more global and incorporating all familial responsibilities. Per Levy and Katz's study, all the men reported positive perceptions of equality. Gender division of housework is not a problem for traditional women because partners in traditional setups perform different tasks and homemaking responsibilities bear a certain degree of significance that is appreciated. Traditional women are less likely to be employed outside the home, and as such, unequal unpaid labor is counterbalanced by husbands' unequal participation in paid labor. Kaufman argues that gender role attitudes affect men and women differently in the context of family formation and dissolution. Egalitarian women are less likely to intend to have a child, but more likely to actually have a child than traditional women. Therefore, egalitarian attitudes could be associated with reduced fertility in women. Egalitarian women have high equality expectations, which could explain the lack of enthusiasm when it comes to having children. Egalitarian men are more likely to cohabit, less likely to divorce because they can keep their partners attracted to them, which translates to being more likely to have stable unions. More likely to be open to alternative living arrangements such as splitting gender roles equally owing to their attractiveness, thereby having fewer conflicts with their partners. More likely to intend to have a child, less likely to be dissuaded from having children because they believe in shared parenting as opposed to completing the family, more interested in doing family than gender. More likely to find cohabitation more attractive, and more likely to be intimidated by their partner's performance in the labor force, compared to traditional men. On the one hand, traditional husbands and egalitarian wives have the lowest marital quality because the wives have higher quality demands or expectations that are met with conflict and resistance. On the other hand, traditional wives and egalitarian husbands form the most stable unions. Thus, egalitarian attitudes in men promote stability, while they cause instability when expressed by women. Overall, Kaufman maintains that egalitarian men want children and stay married, while the opposite is true for egalitarian women, because equality is interpreted differently by the sexes. Particularly, equality for women means being anti-family to a certain extent, that is, less time at home and more time in economically viable activities, while egalitarian men are pro-family with the expectation of assistance from their wives.